All right, so a couple things off the top. First thing I want to mention is that hackback assignment, which I have set to be at the same due date as this week's quiz and module reading. So this has already been available since last week. I said you kind of get on, start this. I think a little bit more about it in today's class. So it's really looking at price floors, right? And what price floor specifically the minimum wage. So I've got a bunch of different articles here, especially like these academic. I'm not expecting you to go through these with a fine-tooth comb. You want to open them, read the summaries. I think that probably is sufficient. If you're kind of interested, you can kind of read further. I summarize really each one kind of for you, pose some additional questions, kind of talk about what might be a reason we want to use the minimum wage, maybe why not, getting you thinking a little bit harder about it than what we just talked about in class. So even some of the stuff we talked about today might kind of be helpful in discussing some of these different issues or some of these different questions that are posed. So make sure you're getting on, get that done early. Since you don't have a quiz or module reading right now, I would say try to do it the next couple of days, right? Because after Thursday's class, you'll have this week's module quiz and this week or next week's module reading, right? Kind of as usual. So that's currently up there, due at the end of the day, Monday, matching up with that next module reading and that next quiz. Should be easy points as long as you're getting on and getting that done. This is a reminder, you're going to get full credit there. It gives you like that curiosity score, which is just an AI metric of whether or not you're making a thoughtful response. Try not to, like, I know it asks for citations. Don't put things in like quotes from other sources. It needs to be primarily your own thoughts and your own kind of words. Otherwise, that score is going to be low. Okay? So try to get on, get that done, get that discussion kind of going back and forth early before that due date. We should have plenty of time. This should be effort-based points, easy points for all of you. So if you're concerned about what you got in the exam, this is a good way to kind of start help pulling your grade up. Okay. Other than that, so last week's quiz had a couple of people reach out. Where is it at? Am I looking right through it? Did I not put it on the main page here? There we go. So the last question, like I tried to give you the correct answer. Some people accidentally somehow messed that up. My intent was to give you all credit. So I'll go on this afternoon, and if for some reason you accidentally selected the wrong answer to that last question, I'll give you credit for that, right? There's also something that someone brought up. I think it was questions 8 and 9. It was either 8 or 9 or 7 or 8. I'll correct those once I get back to my office. There's nothing really to correct. Are you here for your wallet?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Leo.
I know, let me make sure you look like, yeah, you're good.
Thank you.
All right. So, I gave you these numbers that went with these dashed lines. I think, I'm not going to pull it up for the sake of time, but like some people got confused with thinking about that was also representing the intercept of like the supply curve. I think that most people should have been able to figure out it was the numbers were going with those dashed lines. But just in case you weren't, you could have gotten the right answer or wrong answer. I'm going to give everybody credit for those. So be a little bit nice on those. If there was any confusion, that was not my intent to cause you to get the wrong answer because of that. When it comes to the exam or something like that, a little bit more kind of careful, giving you full grid lines as opposed to just kind of a couple different points. I thought giving you just a few points would be helpful, but there was some confusion of whether or not the number went with the dash line or the intercept. Okay, so I'll get those scores updated this afternoon. Other than that, we should be kind of set to kind of jump into material unless there's any questions. Okay. A little bit easier to get to class today when it's not so cold. Maybe a little bit more difficult since it's nice out. So I've got a bunch of stuff in the slides here. I'm going to just kind of start out building this out for us. The one thing that we didn't quite cover, and it'll kind of coincide with a lot of stuff we're going to talk about today, but we had one more price control we didn't talk about specifically last week in terms of how it impacted surplus, which was this idea of a subsidy. Okay. So we typically have kind of our supply, our demand curve. And you kind of think about, here was like our equilibrium quantity and our equilibrium price without any government intervention. So if I'm thinking about producer and consumer surplus, anytime we talk about economic surplus, it's the difference between that group, producers or consumers, their marginal benefits and their marginal costs. So what are the marginal benefits to consumers? That's represented by our demand curve. What's the marginal cost to consumers? The price that they have to pay. So kind of visually, where would our consumer surplus be? It's like that triangle on top. Okay. What would producer surplus be? Well, what are the marginal benefits to producers? When I sell something, the benefit is the price. What's the marginal cost? That's represented by our supply curve. Okay. So we'll think about how these things would be impacted if instead of taxes or price ceilings or price floors, the government gives a subsidy. So I'll draw these out and kind of give you depictions of subsidies to producers. I'll give you a glimpse later on in today's class of subsidies to consumers. They'd work the exact same way, but I'll kind of only expect you to know, kind of thinking about how a subsidy would impact things in terms of social surplus, just operating through giving it to producers, kind of limit the scope of what you need to know. So if I give companies money for producing something, so maybe I want more electric vehicles. So I tell car companies, for every electric vehicle you produce, I'll give you, I'll give you $2,000, right? Some subsidy, right? Or a lot of times we give farmers agricultural subsidies for planting things in fields. So if I give a company some additional money, what are their costs to producing that good? It's going to be whatever it was before, but now I'm getting a certain amount of money back from the government. So it's really like my costs are lower, right? How much lower? Well, my costs are going to be whatever they were before, but now I'm going to kind of have like plus the subsidy. Now it gets kind of weird because like I'm getting subsidies, so that's actually going to lower the company's marginal costs. So when we give these companies subsidies, it's actually like we're thinking about, it's almost like it's increasing the supply curve. You can kind of think about it that way. Intuitively, it makes sense. If I give a company money for producing something, are they going to want to produce more or less than before? More, right? So we kind of have this like supply increase. So let's think about now, where's the new price for this good? Well, where does this new supply curve with a subsidy hit my demand curve? It's going to be down here at this price. Try to make consumers blue a lot of the time. So if I'm thinking about what did that do? So what was total surplus before the subsidy? So total surplus for the market, we don't care if it's producer or consumers, just the difference between our supply and demand curve, right? That represents our marginal benefits and the marginal costs in the market. Consumer surplus, we said, would have been this little triangle up here. After the subsidy, what's the new price consumers pay? It's now lower. So intuitively, what's going to happen to consumer surplus? If the price that they now have to pay is lower, consumer surplus should be going up. So now, what's the new quantity in the market after the subsidy? It's now higher. They're paying a lower price, so consumer surplus is going to be this larger triangle. So with this subsidy, consumer surplus is increased. Now, what's happened to producer surplus? Well, when a consumer hands over, say, $40,000 for the car, what's the total amount that the company gets? They get that $40,000, but who are they also getting money from? The government. So they're getting $40,000 plus whatever the subsidy is. So the price that the sellers get, or we kind of sometimes reference this as the price the sellers keep, right? The total amount they get is now going to be higher than the old equilibrium price. So intuitively, they're selling things for a higher price. They're selling a higher number of units. What's going to happen to producer surplus? It's going to go up. Where would it be? The difference between the supply curve and this new price that they're going to get to keep, right? Or this new value that they're going to get to keep might be a better way to say it. Okay. So you'll notice we've got some area here where it's like blue and red. It's consumer and it's being double counted. It represents producer, but also consumer surplus. So if I was like adding this up to get total, that area would be like getting added in twice, right? Now I also have this little bit here that was just a gain in consumer surplus, and this little triangle here that was just being counted once, which was producer surplus. So we might look at this initially and think, well, this is great. Subsidies increase producer and consumer surplus, so what should happen to total surplus? It's went up. But just like taxes, who do we now have to factor in? With taxes, we had producer, consumer surplus, and tax revenue from the government. Tax revenue is a positive economic surplus for the government. If the government is giving money to producers to make something, we're not going to have tax revenue. We're going to actually have government expenditures, right? They're going to actually be paying for every single unit here. So think about what's the total government expenditure. It's going to be the total quantity after the subsidy multiplied by what? For every unit that's sold, what is it going to cost the government? The value of the subsidy, right? However much money they're giving for every electric vehicle produced. So the quantity sold after the subsidy multiplied by the value of the subsidy, that's just total cost to the government. So now, unlike tax revenue, it's not positive economic surplus. Here it would actually be negative. So notice, what is that visually represented by? Well, this is the value of the subsidy. This is the quantity sold after the subsidy. So this rectangle here represents government expenditure. So you'll kind of notice that area that was being double counted, now we have it being like triple counted, except for one of the times it's being counted, it is a negative value. So think about it this way. If I take 1 plus 1, and I subtract 1, what am I left with? 1, right? This area is only being counted once now. So total surplus really hasn't changed from what we had before. We are a healthy bunch today, right? Jeez. So what about this area here? Well, this was gain of producers that's now canceled out by this additional government expenditure. Here's the gain of consumers that's canceled out by government expenditure. This remaining area of that rectangle, is there anything for it to cancel out? No. So even though producers and consumers gained surplus, it was canceled out by this huge government expenditure. And part of that government expenditure, there was nothing for it to cancel out. So this is going to represent a negative surplus value, or what do you think this represents? A loss of surplus is our deadweight loss. So it looks a little bit different than when we have price ceilings, floors, taxes, because our deadweight loss triangle was like pointing to the left. Now, sorry, it was pointing to the right. Now we're going to end up with our deadweight loss triangle actually point to the left. So the reason why is because relative, so I'll kind of, this is a bit muddied up, so I'll kind of just draw a quick one out here. So let's say I've got my supply and demand, the market, kind of where total surplus would be maximized is right here, but then there's a subsidy, right? So after this subsidy, the new quantity we said was out here at a higher point. So what is, sorry, not society. I'm sorry. I'm going ahead to the next topic. So this is the quantity after the subsidy. Sorry. So what is the market doing relative to the equilibrium after I impose this subsidy? Is it over or under producing? So this equilibrium quantity is where total surplus for the market is maximized. So if the subsidy pushes the quantity out here, we're actually overproducing. All the other price controls we talked about last week, underproducing, right? So we said the deadweight loss with taxes, prices, and floors all came from surplus that was lost from units we weren't producing anymore. Works a little bit differently now because now we're overproducing. So where does the deadweight loss come from? Well, remember, what is economic surplus? So if we don't care about consumers or producers, it's just the difference between marginal benefits and marginal costs, or the difference between our supply and demand curve. So for every unit past this point, what's true about the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs? The marginal costs are higher. So this would actually represent negative surplus. So now with subsidies, the deadweight loss is coming from the negative surplus that exists from overproducing. So it's just creating deadweight loss in a different way. It's no longer from units that were not seeing produced in the market that would have had some positive economic surplus. It's now coming from units that are overproduced that incur some negative total economic surplus in the market. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep on pushing forward here? Yeah. I can't hear what you're saying.
The consumer surplus I'm still not sure how to draw.
All right, we'll go through it. I've got another visual, okay? So, it's another way of seeing this, okay? So, we kind of just talked about where does that deadweight loss come from? It comes from the fact that after this subsidy, we're overproducing. So I'm likely to ask you more questions in terms of subsidies, probably not about consumer and producer surplus. I'm showing you why the deadweight loss exists by doing that. I'm a lot more likely to ask you what the deadweight loss is, right? And that would be the loss of surplus, the area in between our supply and demand curve, every unit that we overproduce with this subsidy. So we'll give you another way of thinking about this. Without any subsidy, what is consumer surplus here? The area in between consumers' marginal benefits and marginal costs. Consumers' marginal benefits are the demand curve. Their costs are the equilibrium price. So which of these colored rectangles represents consumer surplus? Top one or the blue one. What does the red triangle represent? Producer. This is total surplus before the subsidy. After the subsidy, the new price consumers pay is going to be low. So now where would consumer surplus be? Well, now it's the area below the demand curve, but not above 500, above this new market price, this new price consumers pay, which is 400. So you kind of notice it's not that small blue triangle anymore, it's this much larger area. So consumer surplus is going to go up, right? Going to increase. Now, what price do the sellers get to keep? Well, here, I'm not telling you. What's the value of the subsidy here? So how could I determine? It's very similar to how to determine the value of the tax. If I have a supply curve and the supply curve plus the tax, we said the value of the tax is just the difference between the two at any quantity. What's the difference between my supply curve and my supply curve with a subsidy at any quantity here? Well, I have one quantity I can look at. The difference between the price the seller keeps and the consumer pays is, so the value of my subsidy must be $200. So the new price that the seller gets to keep, the consumer hands over $400. They get $200 from the government. So the new price the seller keeps is up here. Where is producer surplus? The area above the supply curve, but below the price that they get to kind of keep here. So now it's not just that small red triangle, it's a much larger red triangle. So we said, okay, what's going to happen here? This area, whoops, like here is going to be double counted, right? However, it's double counted, but we haven't factored in yet an additional negative surplus, which is government expenditure, which is this entire rectangle, right? The value of the subsidy times the quantity sold after the subsidy. So this yellow area is going to kind of cancel out everything that was double counted. It's also going to cancel out this like new gain from producers and consumers. And it's also going to have this area that there's nothing to cancel out. So what is our deadweight loss after we kind of factor that in? Everything that was double counted is canceled out by that government expenditure, only being counted once. So surplus is whatever it was before. But now we have this additional loss of surplus from every unit that was being produced past that market quantity, past that quantity that was efficient for the market. Okay. So wouldn't focus as much. I probably won't ask you to identify consumer and producer surplus, right? But kind of knowing how to identify it helps us see why the deadweight loss would be this area here. Okay. Any other questions before we keep moving here? Mm-hmm.
It's not really a question.
I mean, you could do it, but my example, right? 1 + 1 is 2, minus 1 is 1. Right? So you're double counting it, and then you're getting a negative value that's equal to whatever value you double counted. So you'd be right back at only counting it one time. What's the red triangle represent? Producer surplus. Yep. Okay. Well, it's not flipped, right? It looks like it's on top, which I said that's not a very technical way of remembering it. In this case, the visual doesn't line up with the way we would usually think about it. Why? Well, it's still technically the triangle is like on the bottom. It's just so large now that when they overlay on each other, like it's still pointing the same direction as producer surplus should be. It's just larger now. Yep. So that's not a technical way of remembering it. The real way we identify producer and consumer surplus is the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal cost of consumers. That's the way to correctly identify it. I said in a lot of the old models before today, it was a non-technical way of remembering it. That won't always work as we kind of progress and work through more topics. Okay. All right. So we've got subsidies, right? I've got kind of a summary if you want to go back here. The next thing we're going to talk about are externalities. Okay. So got a bunch up here. We'll talk through the idea and then we'll kind of look at more of the model depiction of it. So all an externality means is it's like an external cost or benefit to somebody not involved in the market. So I always give like an example, if you have positive production externalities, kind of one I always think about is like beekeepers, people that are producing honey with like these huge bee boxes you'll see if you drive around Indiana. Even if I don't buy honey, I am benefiting from the market of honey existing. Why? Because what do bees do? Pollinate, so every other crop in the area benefits, right? Even if I just like flowers, right? So I'm receiving some additional benefit from the existence of that honey or that beekeeping market, even if I'm not a consumer or a producer. Other positive kind of production externalities, like I always think about if you're walking by anywhere, even if you don't stop and eat there, if the food smells good as you walk by, I'm not a producer or consumer, but what did I just get? An additional benefit from walking by. Kind of a silly example there. Now, the one that we probably more focus on, and we think it's easier to think about, are negative production externalities. So this is pollution. At the end of the day, this is the main negative externality we think about. When companies are out there producing, you know, automobiles, what is a byproduct of all that? These factories are pumping out a bunch of smoke into the air, right? Or Indiana, I don't know how much you guys know about. So the drinking water around like the fields is, you know, when they plant crops, they also put all these pesticides down. There's all this nasty runoff from everything they use to kind of get these crops real quick. That ends up in the drinking water. So it doesn't matter if I have an allergy to corn, I don't buy any product with corn in it. The production of corn, there is a negative externality to me if I live in that area and I drink the water. All right, hopefully the government tries to regulate it, but you know, if you look at the evidence, it still ends up in the drinking water, right? So we've got these negative production externalities. Now we can also have positive externalities, right, that come from consumption, or negative externalities that come from consumption. So those were like the production of two goods. Let's say the best like positive externality I always think about is like what you guys are doing right now. If you get a higher education, you get a college degree, it's going to benefit you and it benefits the university. Who else does it benefit? Well, everything you do after you leave here that uses anything you learned here that benefits society, come up with some new product, even if it's a financial tool, even if it, you know, how well you're doing at your job, even if you're selling insurance after you leave, you're benefiting other people that weren't involved in your market for education. There's a positive consumption externality for higher education on the rest of society. another really good example, immunizations. If everybody except for me is immunized in this room, guess what I get to enjoy the benefit of? I'm not going to get sick. Because none of you are going to get sick, so you can't share it to me. I didn't even have to go get the shot, right? Now, we run into some problems with that. We'll talk about later on Thursday, but that would be the idea of a positive consumption externality. Negative consumption externality, the one I always think about like is a terrible neighbor or a terrible roommate, right? So if your roommate is in the market for video games and is yelling at his screen at 2 or 3 in the morning, right? You're not involved in the video game market at all. You're not a consumer or a producer. But what is that doing? It's imposing an additional cost on you. It's a negative externality, right? Same idea, people that smoke, right? Even if I don't smoke, if someone's smoking in the room that I'm in, right? I'm breathing in this smoke. I don't like it. I have this additional cost, this negative externality. So we can have negative and positive externalities. We'll really focus on negative externalities today. I'll introduce positive externalities at the end of class. But kind of starting out, what does a negative externality look like? Okay, so, oops, I went a little fast. So if we have our original supply and demand curve, they represent marginal benefits and marginal costs. We now have to throw a caveat onto that. It's the marginal benefits of the people involved in that market and the marginal cost of people involved. So we're going to call these the private marginal benefits and the private marginal costs. So we can differentiate these between society's marginal benefits and society's marginal costs. So our kind of typical supply and demand curve, if we allow the market to make decisions, they will go to the point where what? The private marginal benefits are equal to the private marginal cost, or the supply is equal to demand. So that would be out here to what? A quantity of 25. Okay. So the market is going to arrive at a quantity where total surplus is maximized for the people in that market. They're not taking into consideration the fact that as I'm producing gasoline, I'm creating a lot of pollution that has this huge additional cost on society. They're not factoring that into their decision making. So what do you think, just intuitively, if they're not factoring in these additional costs, what do you think the quantity they arrive at? Is that going to be higher or lower than what society wants? Higher, right? They're not factoring in these huge pollution costs. They're going to be making a decision like, oh, who cares? We're not going to have to clean it up. So if they don't factor in these costs, they're always going to end up at a quantity that's too high. So we can think about visually, what does this look like, right? So if I'm thinking about now, not from the market standpoint, but from society, society's costs are whatever it costs to produce this gasoline, whatever the private marginal costs were, but society is going to bear this additional cost of pollution. So what's going to happen? That every single quantity, the cost is going to be whatever it was before, plus some additional amount. So what is this kind of going to look like? If I was to draw where society's marginal cost curve is, it's going to kind of look like a shift in supply. Not only a shift, what does it look like? So what would this represent? A decrease in supply. So for society, because there's these additional costs, society's supply curve, we usually don't call it that. We usually identify it as like society's marginal cost curve. But society's supply curve is going to be lower than what the private marginal supply curve, or sorry, the private supply curve would be, or the private marginal costs. So here, I'll kind of start calling this like MSC, abbreviating the marginal social costs. And they're always going to be higher. If we have negative externalities, we know the costs are going to be higher to society than the people in the market. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? I don't want to move too fast. So how much, or what's the difference between society's costs and the private marginal cost? So I'm going to jump the gun a little bit to when we're going to talk about subsidies later as well. So not subsidies, positive externalities. I was looking at that sheet. So the marginal social costs are going to be whatever the marginal costs were. There we go. To the people in that market. So whatever the producer's marginal costs were, plus what we're going to call the external cost, or the value of that negative externality. So as long as negative externalities exist, what has to be true about the marginal social costs? They have to be higher than the marginal. As long as we have some negative externality that exists, the marginal social cost curve is going to be higher. Okay? Now, kind of similarly, if we think about positive externalities, that's going to be whatever marginal benefits exist to the people in that market, plus what? Not an external cost, but an external benefit. All right. So what's going to be true about if we have a positive externality? Society's marginal benefits will always be what relative to the marginal benefits of consumers? Higher. Yep. So if we had, so this is like a negative externality, we had a positive externality, this has to be true. Okay. All right. So if I'm thinking about what's the difference in between my society's costs and my private marginal costs, that value should just be what? If I rearrange this equation, what's the difference between society's costs and the private marginal costs? Yeah, it's just the value of that negative externality or the cost of people outside of that market, that external cost. Okay. Everybody with me here before we keep moving? Okay. So here in this example, I told you the external cost is $1, right? So it shifted that marginal social cost curve up. So if I think about here, we know that the market would stop at 25. Where would society, if they could make the decision, where do they want the quantity to be? Where the marginal social costs are equal to the marginal social benefit. Well, here, if I don't have any positive externalities, we're just looking at negative externalities. The private marginal benefits will also be the marginal social benefits, right? There's no positive externalities. We only have negative externalities. Yeah. The market will. So we're thinking about if society could choose the quantity, where would they choose? The market will stop at 25. We want to compare that to where society would want it so we can know how bad that is for society. So we need to understand where would society's surplus be maximized, where society's marginal costs are equal to society's marginal benefits. That would be right here at this lower quantity of 20. So to your point, what is the market doing? The market would be overproducing relative to the point that would maximize surplus for society. They'll maximize surplus for people in that market, but that won't be where surplus is maximized for society. You can kind of think about why. So when we're talking about economic surplus to society, it's the difference between what? Economic surplus is the difference between marginal benefits and marginal, but now we're talking about society. So it's the difference between the marginal benefits to society, which we said is just the demand curve because we didn't have any positive externalities, and the marginal cost to society. So if I think about like a unit at 10, what's the economic surplus to society? Well, the difference between the marginal social cost, that green line, and the marginal social benefit, there's some positive surplus to society there. However, if I go past that quantity of 20, at a quantity of 25, what's true about the surplus of that 2050 to society? The marginal costs are greater than the marginal benefits. So what is true about that surplus? It would be the surplus is benefits minus costs. So if the costs are higher, negative. Right? So do we want to produce if there's negative surplus? No. That would actually be lowering surplus for society. So we want to stop, just like anything, the society wants it to be where their marginal benefits are equal to their marginal costs. Okay. That would be here at a lower quantity of 20, which we said is kind of intuitive. If society, there's additional costs that the people in the market don't have to bear, the market's always going to end up producing too high. Okay. So what does that loss of surplus represent? Well, what is our definition of the loss of surplus? That is deadweight loss. Now here, we have to be careful. It's not deadweight loss for the market. This would be deadweight loss for who? So we're identifying 20 was the quantity that maximized society's total surplus. So if we go past that point, the loss of surplus there represented a loss of surplus to society. So we're trying to figure out if we allow these markets to operate freely, how bad is that going to be for society? Because we know the market will maximize their own surplus. They don't give a shit about society, right? That's why we have things like pollution, okay? So we know the market's always going to go too high. We're trying to figure out how bad is that going to be for society, okay? Is that making sense a little bit? We'll see this in some different contexts here. So I'm going to mention this ahead of time. I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but what would one solution I could do if I want to lower the quantity? What could I do? Talked about last week. I could tax it. What else could I do? What else lower quantity? Price ceilings, price floors, quotas. I'll go through an example later where I kind of show you what this looks like, but we're going to think about, okay, the market's getting to a quantity that's too high. That deadweight loss was coming from the fact that we were overproducing past that socially efficient quantity. Okay? So what do we want to do? For society, we want to limit the quantity back, right? We want to push that quantity back. So we can use taxes, we can do some other things. Kind of like this graph, so I'm not going to draw it out because I think hopefully seeing it visually here will make more sense first. Not always do I feel that way, but I do this time, okay? So if I start out and I just think about it, just have a negative externality. What is total surplus to society if we're at that socially efficient quantity? Well, where's the socially efficient quantity? It's where society's marginal costs. So this is where I start writing kind of MSC is like the marginal social costs or the marginal social benefits. But we don't have any positive externalities, so that's just the same as our private marginal benefits. Where would those two things be equal? Looks like here it's at a quantity of 40. What would total surplus be to society? Just the difference between society's marginal benefit and society's marginal cost. This black area should be when society's total surplus is maximized, this is what it would be. So you might initially think, okay, if we allow the market to make the decision, what quantity do they end up at? Roughly, looks like, well, where does the supply equal to the demand curve? That's the market. Looks like at a quantity of 55. So the market is producing what? Too much, right? They're 15 units over the quantity that would maximize surplus for everybody in society. Now, the reason why they operate at that higher quantity is because who have they maximized surplus for? Themselves, right? So what is producer and consumer surplus? Well, at this market equilibrium price, if we don't get involved, consumer surplus, area below the demand curve, but above price. Producer surplus, area below price, which is their marginal benefit, but above their marginal cost, which is the supply curve. So this is where the market will kind of arrive at, and this is the total surplus that exists just to the people in that market. So you might look at me and be like, well, yeah, okay. Why is this a problem? Looks like total surplus is higher if we allow the market to operate freely at will. But if we're calculating social surplus, what have we not factored in yet? The fact that there is a negative externality. What does that negative externality do? It incurs an additional cost to someone. So before I show you the visual, let's think about when the market stops at a certain quantity, what's the total external cost? So if I'm wanting to calculate this total external cost, it's going to be whatever that market equilibrium quantity is. So however many units are produced and sold in that market, what's the cost to society, the additional cost, sorry, from every unit produced? That would just be the, the total external cost is the quantity produced times, well, what's the external cost of each unit? Or what was kind of that value for every unit of our negative externality? So what does this kind of look like? If I'm taking one number, multiplying it by another geometrically, what would that look like? Square, rectangle, could be a parallelogram, which might end up being what we end up seeing, right? This is all the total cost is going to be to society. The cost of each unit times the number of units the market stops at. Okay. So what is that going to look like for us visually? Well, first of all, here, got it shaded in for a second. What's the value of my negative externality here? So how would I find the value of the negative externality, the external cost for each unit? It would just be the difference in between my supply curve and what other curve? My marginal social cost. The difference between the two just was the value. And I think about it as like the per unit value of this additional external cost. Now, I think an easy point to do, maybe I'll have a question about this later. I would use the intercepts. So like notice here, what's the difference at the intercept? Well, it goes from what, 10 to 35. So the value of this external cost per unit would be 25. I could use any quantity. So I could go over here. Looks like it's at what, 45, goes up to like 70. So 45 is 70, also 25, right? At any quantity, I'm just looking for the difference between that supply curve and my marginal social cost curve. So if every unit, the additional cost to society is $25, and there's 55 units, kind of that's where the market stopped at, what would the total cost of society be? 55 times 25. What would that represent? Like I said, it could be the area of a rectangle. Here ends up being the area of this kind of parallelogram, right? Well, now notice, what's true about all of the surplus here? It was positive to producers and consumers. What does this red area represent? It's economic surplus to society that is additional cost. It is negative. So kind of like with subsidies, we now have this issue of this area here where they overlap. One of them is positive, one of them is negative. So what happens? They cancel each other out. So all the surplus in this range is canceled out by this additional cost to society. Now, there's also this additional cost to society that there is no gain in surplus, right? There's nothing for it to cancel out. So what is that going to represent? If it's an additional loss, there's no positive to kind of cancel it out. It will be our deadweight loss, right? So yes, the market will maximize producer and consumer surplus. However, if we allow the market to operate freely at will, what is total surplus here? Total surplus would be this triangle minus, well, this is negative surplus for society, so minus this little area. So are we worse off than we were before? Well, if we were just at that socially efficient quantity, not out here at 55, we said total surplus would just be this. So what have we done if we allow the market to operate freely at will? Society's surplus will now be this minus this additional amount. So we've lowered society's total surplus. So if we allow these markets to operate, they won't factor in these additional costs to society. They're going to end up at a quantity that is too high, right? For society, the quantity that will actually lower society's total surplus. And we can think about why. For every single unit past this point, what was true about society's marginal cost relative to society's marginal benefits? They were greater. So that area would represent for every unit there, the surplus to society was actually negative. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Yep. Yep, would be the external cost. Like, think about it as like the per unit additional cost. Yep. All right, so let me see here. Any other questions on this? Yeah. Yeah, we're thinking about here what deadweight loss would exist if the market operated. Yep. Any other questions on this one before we keep moving here? Okay. I don't know. I know it starts to get a little more complicated where we have areas where it's like positive and negative, so it cancels out. It's a little bit trickier to see. you kind of imagine if we were at society's optimal point, what was the surplus of the last unit here? To society, the total surplus of this unit would be what? Well, if the marginal social cost is equal to the marginal social benefit, what was the surplus of the very last unit? 0, right? So if I go anywhere past that, I'm taking whatever total surplus was before, and I'm just adding negative values to it. So if total surplus was maximized before, as I had negative values, what's happening? It's just getting lower, right? So overproducing past that socially efficient quantity, we're just going to end up with a loss of surplus to society. Excuse me. So I've got, whoops, a quiz that should be sitting on the home page. We'll make sure that everyone can see this. Should be available. I think I have it set to be, well, let's see, due, I think at 10:30. 10:35, right? So we should have more than enough time. So I've gotten a couple people. Look, I get that there could be some connectivity issues in here. For the last while, giving you enough time. If you have an issue, when do you think you need to let me know? 3 days later? What do you think I think you're doing to me if you tell me 3 days later that you had connectivity issues in class 3 days ago? Do you think I think you were in class? No, I think you're lying to me. Why wouldn't you just tell me immediately after class? This goes for anything, and it's not just this class, it's any professor. Guess what I can be to you if you let me know things as far in advance as possible? You think I can be more or less elastic? A lot more elastic, right? So let me know if you have an issue in class with one of these in-class quizzes. When should you let me know, you think? Immediately after class. Like, come up here after class, okay? So I don't want to be getting emails 3 days later, and then I have to, feel bad about, questioning whether or not you're there. Let me know immediately afterwards, okay? So I'll give you guys a couple minutes to work on. We won't go through these completely together, so I'd really kind of work hard in these with the people around you. I'll give you about 5-6 minutes or so. We might discuss them a little bit. I won't kind of pull them up and go through them. But just 2 questions. We should have already covered both of them. Talk to people around you, like I said, and we'll kind of reconvene here in about 5 or 6 minutes. Everybody getting it pulled open okay? Is it popping up? Just making sure, okay. All right. So not due till 35, what, 10:35. So we'll talk through it. So I won't pull them up. We'll kind of walk through how we would solve these in general. Okay. Does that help at all? Yes. Okay. So let's say I had this market and I'm currently letting the market operate freely. We'll call this like the market quantity, okay, or the equilibrium quantity the market gets to. In that graph, what does it look like that quantity is? I mean, we don't have to work through this together if you guys don't want to help me, but I can help you get more likely to get the right answer. What quantity is where supply is equal to demand? Okay, never mind. On the quiz that you guys just took, no one wants to tell me the number? Is it not clear what I'm asking? The two quiz questions you guys just worked on, right? If you want to tell me the values, I'll work through those right now with you before you submit it. If people want to give me those values, I don't have it pulled open. So where does supply equal demand on those questions? 60, okay? You also are given what? A marginal social cost. You guys are lying to me. 50, right? What's the consensus? Is it 50 or 60? I didn't think this was going to be that difficult. All right. So where does supply equal demand at a quantity of 60? What are you also given in that graph? So what type of externality do we have here if the social cost curve is higher? Negative externality. The first thing you're asked is what's the value of that negative externality? If I remember right, this makes more sense. Was this 45? What was the quantity here? 50? Okay. So the quantity here, huh? Oh, the grid lines aren't labeled? Yeah, so if I don't give these to you, so that's part of the, okay, so we start out, how do I know that the marginal social cost curve has to be higher? Anytime I have a negative externality, which of those cost curves has to be higher? My social costs, right? It factors in the cost of producers plus some additional amount. So we shouldn't have to label them. I'm labeling them here because I'm working through it, but your point is taken, right? So this curve should have been the supply curve. I guess I should have started out asking you how to label them. I was kind of identifying that supply curve was going to be the one that was further out to the right, right? So this represents what? Kind of society's efficient quantity. How do I find the value of this negative externality, their external cost? I said earlier, what's a really easy point to look at? The intercept. Where do my intercepts start out at? 10, and then, so what's the value of my external cost? It's just the difference in between the private marginal cost and societies. So here, what would the value of this negative externality per unit be? Yeah. You could look at any other quantity and you should find that same value. The difference between those two lines should always be 15. Okay. All right. Rough start here. So deadweight loss, what is this market doing relative to where society wants the quantity to be? They are overproducing. So the deadweight loss is going to come from the fact that the market overproduces. So if they're overproducing and we have a loss of surplus, that must mean that for society, every unit past this point, the costs to society are greater than the benefits. So every unit here, this would represent negative surplus from those 10 units. So if it's negative surplus, what is that going to do to our society's total surplus? Decrease it or represent our deadweight loss. Well, I already know the base of this triangle is what? 10. Notice what's a nice, easy thing. So what does this represent? I need room. Number of kind of overproduced units. What is the height of this triangle always going to be? The difference in between my supply curve and my marginal social cost curve. This is always going to just be, why do I know this is 15? That difference is always the value of my external cost. So in finding this deadweight loss, the height of that triangle will always be the value of the external cost. The base of that triangle is always going to be the number of units I'm overproducing by. And then it's area of a triangle, so I still need to multiply by 1/2. So this is what, 75? If I'm doing math in my head correct there. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? So using the same idea, if I had asked you a different question, what's the total cost to society? How could I find that? So if I allow the market to operate freely at will, I'm going to get 60 units. I know the value of the external cost per unit. What would the total cost to society be? Yep. So this is just going to be, where does the free market, or where's the market stop at or arrive at? And then every unit, the additional cost is their external cost. So the total cost of society would be just the number of units times the kind of per unit external cost. Okay. This is what, 900, if I'm looking at this right? Maybe. Yeah. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. So it goes a little bit longer. You still have 2 minutes to kind of get that submitted. We'll kind of keep on moving. So I'm going to jump ahead in the slides a little bit. But if we have these negative externalities, we can talk about things that solve this overproduction problem. Okay. So we said that the market is going to arrive at this quantity that's too high and a price that's right here. So if I've got negative externalities, where does society want that quantity to be? A little bit lower, and they would want the price to be kind of up here. Okay. So what are some ways I could get this? So I mentioned one earlier. What's one way I could push the market back to this socially efficient quantity? Use a tax. What do taxes do? They shift or they decrease our supply curve. So what would the value of the tax that exactly match my new supply curve up with my marginal social costs? What would the perfect tax be equal to? So what's the difference between my private marginal cost and society's marginal cost? The external cost. So a perfect tax would just be equal to that per unit external cost, or the value of that negative externality per unit. We call that a Pigovian tax. So some of this is in the slides. I'll gloss over it quickly. But here, the tax, imposing a tax on producers will kind of shift that supply curve back until it equally matches up with society's marginal cost curve. So what have we done? Well, these producers weren't factoring in the additional cost of society before. We've added that cost to their, so now they are making decisions as though the total cost to them is exactly what society's costs are. We say we've made those producers internalize that additional cost to society. Now, how do we do it? We needed the government, right? We need them to impose that tax, force them to internalize it. But if we can, now the market, with this new supply curve plus the tax, will stop here at that socially efficient quantity. Now, we could also tax consumers here and have a similar impact. We kind of only focus on taxes on producers, so that's why I'm trying to limit the scope of what I want you to understand. And I think it's easier to kind of see here taxes on producers. Oh yeah, that raises their costs until the producers' costs exactly match up with society's costs. Now they start making decisions just like they are society. Okay, so hopefully they'll be now making decisions that maximize society's total surplus. Okay. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? So the perfect tax would be the value of that external cost. What's another thing I could do? So let's say I imposed a price control. Now, what type of price control? A lot of people just mix or mess with them on the quiz. What would this have to be, a floor or a ceiling, in order for it to be effective? A floor, right? So if I told you it was a price ceiling, what happens in this market? Nothing, right? Because if you tell me you can't charge a price any higher than 50, I'm only charging 40, okay, nothing's going to change. So we could kind of set this price floor. Now notice here, we can actually say, or it's a little bit easier to figure out what the value of that price floor should be. It's whatever that price kind of society would want for that good to be, for it to kind of be at the socially efficient quantity. So we can impose a price floor. What else could I do? If I wanted to limit quantity, I could also impose what would this represent? An effective price ceiling. Now nobody's going to want to supply it past this quantity. So I've got price floors, price ceilings, taxes will all push the quantity back. And now a really easy one, we don't often see this used as much. Although if we believe that there's negative externalities from other countries' products, what might we see in the news a lot right now? Not as tariffs, but we could also impose. So tariffs are really like a tax on other countries' goods. We could also just simply impose a quota where we just limit the number that comes in. So notice it doesn't matter. Like some words sound better to certain people than others, but what's the effect if I have a tariff, which is just a tax, or a quota on another country's goods? I still get to the same quantity. All right. So, I don't necessarily think this is probably the case on a lot of the tariffs, but what would an argument be for using tariffs? If I don't use a tariff or a tax, what's going to be true if the market's out here? We're going to have some deadweight loss. So what's the only justification for a tariff? It would have to be that those products, what exists because of them. So why are we using a tax? We initially started out with the fact that there's why is society's cost higher? What have we been talking about for the last 45 minutes? Starts with an E. Yeah. Externalities. So what's the only justification for using a tax? If we have a negative externality, that would be the only reason why it would make sense for society, why it could actually increase society's total surplus. Same kind of idea for a quota. What would be just, it must be that there's a negative externality. If not, the government's just doing weird political stuff, right? Which probably 99% of the time, that's what they're doing. But, if they have economists in their ear, they would tell them only to use these things if you have a market where a negative externality exists. Okay. So I didn't write the fourth one down. Quota, right? Okay. Any other questions on this before we keep moving here? Yeah.
Is which one would be the best? Do you know?
Not really. They all get us to the same point. In practice, it's probably if we have a complete picture of the market, all of them are going to be equally as easy.
I think the example would be I'll say which one's the best one to use.
Nope. Because they're all, no, I'll just ask you, if you use this specific one, what would happen? Right? Or which of the following would kind of reduce some of the deadweight loss from a negative externality? Yep. Yeah, there's no one that's better than another. Right? There's no like rank ordering them. They all kind of have the, I drew them all to have the same end result. So none of them are better than another. Yep. So what else have I not said? I'll skip ahead a little bit here through the positive externality stuff. We talked about corrective taxes using Pigovian taxes. To be fair, a lot of economists would probably say like quotas aren't as ideal, that you really want to make people internalize these additional costs. So market-based strategies by using taxes are probably what most economists would say are preferred, but ultimately they can all have the exact same implications on social surplus. So we really don't care at the end of the day. So we talked about kind of internalizing it. That's making sure that the tax is the exact same as the value of that external cost. Now the producers start acting as though they are society. So these are all things we talked about. I think I drew this out for you. And then I want to set us up for next class. So we've got one more thing we kind of need to get through here. Okay. So I can get a black marker that works. So let's say I've got a market. And now instead of additional cost, a negative externality, now I'm going to have an additional benefit. So if I have a positive externality, one way we can model this, or the way that we'll model this, is at every single quantity, the marginal benefits to society are whatever the marginal benefits are to the people in that market. So like this is the idea of you getting a higher education degree. It benefits you, but also you are now a more productive member of society. So for society, there's also this additional benefit to people who aren't even involved in your market for education. So where is the marginal social benefit curve going to be? At every quantity, the marginal social benefit is whatever it was to the consumers plus some additional amount. So society's benefits, this is, I think, kind of also intuitive. If there's an additional benefit or a positive externality, is society's benefits going to be higher or lower? Well, there's an additional benefit, so it's going to be higher, right? Now, we think about letting the market decide. Where did they choose? So with a positive externality, the market was choosing a quantity down here. Okay. Where would the efficient quantity for society be? Well, we don't have any negative externalities anymore, so the marginal costs, that's society's marginal cost. There's no negative externality. We only are looking at a positive externality. So where would the marginal social cost be equal to the marginal social benefit? Well, once again, intuitively, if there's additional benefits that exist to society, is society going to want more or less of that thing? More. So what do we end up seeing? Sure enough, the efficient point for society is higher than what the market will stop at. Okay. So now, for every unit here that the market doesn't produce, what's happening to the economic surplus for society, right? Well, every unit here, what was the economic surplus that would have existed if the market would have went past this point? The difference between society's marginal benefits and society's marginal costs, all of this is now going to represent deadweight loss because the market is underproducing. So it's the exact opposite of negative externalities. we no longer have deadweight loss existing because of the overproduction. We now have deadweight loss coming because the market actually underproduces. They're making decisions that aren't factoring in all of the benefits that exist. They're only making decisions that take the benefits of just the consumers, not everybody else that has this positive externality from that market. Right? So whether or not this is the market for higher education, whether or not this is the market for what I said, immunizations. I also have one that I saw in the news recently that makes, I think, a lot of sense. And also, we talked about two things today. So if the market's stopping at a quantity that's too low, what's the only tool that we've talked about, market-based tool, that can actually increase the quantity in the market? We started out with it today. If I want people to do more of something, I can subsidize it. So guess what I would want to do? Give a subsidy to consumers until demand perfectly matches up with society's overall marginal benefits. Now the consumers will start behaving in a way that matches up with all of the benefits that exist in society. So if I can give consumers a subsidy that matches the value of that external benefit, now I can force the market out to this efficient quantity for society. So anytime we have the underproduction of something or we have positive externalities that exist, the one real tool that we have is the use of subsidies. So I saw this article, I saw this clip. Trump just signed something in where he's trying to give subsidizations to IVF, which is in vitro fertilization. So this is like you're having difficulties having a kid. It's a very expensive process, which people can get pregnant, right? So I would argue this is one thing where whoever's in his ear might actually have somewhat of an idea of what's going on. There's a lot of people who have kids that don't plan to have that kid, right? On average, I'm not saying they all would be, but on average, if you had to take a gamble, would you want to bet on the kid whose parents weren't planning to have them, or the parents who not only planned, but were willing to spend lots of money to have them? I'd lean towards it. Not saying that anyone would, for any one case, but on average, you're likely looking at a group of parents that are probably going to be raising a more productive member of society. So you could argue that those couples are going to have what? Those children have positive externalities on society. We would actually like for kids to be raised by parents who not only were planning to have them, but willing to put in all of this money. So if we know that there's going to be these positive externalities existing from these families who are choosing to have these kids, what might we want to do? Well, if there's a positive externality, we might want to give them subsidies. So once again, I'm not saying I agree with anything of any one politician. That was one story I heard. I'm like, I doubt President Trump come up with that. But someone in his ear might be understanding what's kind of going on, at least at the basic level. Okay. So pack back assignment, and make sure you're getting that done. After Thursday's class, we'll have the next quiz, next module reading. Other than that, enjoy this nice weather, and I will see you guys on Thursday.